At the time of Christ, the temple was one of several structures on the top of the Temple Mount, a huge platform which still exists in Jerusalem, that was absolutely enormous, and within its precincts was built the temple proper, a building not too different in size from our own church. It would have been about as long as the nave of the church and about as wide, maybe a little bit narrower. It would have been much higher. And the temple building was divided into two separate areas within the main body of the temple, and then the Holy of Holies, something like the sanctuary of the church around the altar. And only the Levitical priests would enter the temple. They would enter there to offer prayers, to offer certain ceremonies that were prescribed in the law, and only once a year would the high priest, on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, enter the Holy of Holies and sprinkle there the blood that was offered as part of the sacrifices of atonement at the altar, which was outside of the temple itself. And so the Jewish people didn't gather in the temple. When the temple is mentioned in Jerusalem, it refers to the Temple Mount, the courtyards that surrounded the temple, which were places of public congregation. And there was a courtyard for the men, there was a courtyard for the women, there was a courtyard for the Gentile believers, and there were porticos that connected the various buildings that surrounded this huge, enormous platform, this square. There were places for instruction, for schooling, for meetings, I imagine. I imagine the Knights of Columbus were there even then. Who knows if they're everywhere. And there was also a treasury, a place where people would go to put their offerings, because it was the tradition that when one visited the temple, one also made a monetary offering. This is a great tradition. And in order to collect these offerings, there were in the side of the treasury building these receptacles that looked like the flared end of a trumpet. This is according to the Mishnah, which is a collection of Jewish writings from the first few centuries after Christ that offer commentary upon the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. And these kind of trumpet-like receptacles were there, and so the people could place their coins in, and they would rattle down. You can imagine them swirling down these trumpet-like tubings and then go into the treasury itself, into some kind of lockbox or strong box where they would eventually be collected and used for the purposes of the temple. You know, we have something like that here in our church. I don't know if you know that. But there on the walls of the church, by the side shrines and by the shrines in the transept, and there's kind of a box also near the sacristy where someone can put an offering. And, well, where does it go? It goes down below the church. You know, we have a full basement in this church. Most people don't know that. Yeah, it's kind of like the priest party room down there, and a man cave. No, it's just air conditioning equipment is what it is. So, and some storage. It's only about, I mean, I have to duck to go through some parts of it. It's kind of low, but all of these slots for offerings go down a kind of a shaft into a box that could be locked. Almost nobody uses them. A few times a year we go down there and collect what's in there and put it in the priest vacation fund, which after a year will be enough to get us, you know, for a nice day in Pasadena. Nice town. No, it goes into the general fund, of course. And something similar was the case in Jerusalem, and that is what Jesus is describing. People putting their offerings, which would have been offerings of coins, you know. There was no paper money, of course. And the coins would be made of gold or of silver or bronze or copper, and they'd be tossed into these receptacles. We can almost imagine parents giving their kids a few pennies, go ahead and toss them in there, and the racket that it would make. But the offering of the widow made no noise whatsoever because it was so small. That's where she went to make her offering, just like everyone else. And the gospel tells us that she put in a couple of coins worth about a penny. Scripture scholars will tell us it was the lepta, which was the smallest coin in use in Israel at the time. It was worth 1/400th of a shekel. And a shekel would have been worth, not sure, it could have been worth a day wage, maybe 2 days' wages. It wasn't an enormous amount of money by any stretch of the imagination. And one of these lepta would have been worth 1/400th of that shekel. So these were literally pennies that the lady was putting into this offering box. And the fact that she has 2 pennies and she contributes both of them when she could have justifiably kept one for herself is an extraordinary event. And that's one of the reasons why Jesus invites the attention of his apostles. So she holds her up as an example for the apostles and as an example for us. Why? Why is she an example? Well, there are 2 principal reasons. One, she offers all that she has. I mean, she could have held back 1 coin for herself. That would have been perfectly reasonable. But she offers God her substance and not her leftovers. You know, we give leftovers to the dog. So if we're having a nice steak and there's some gristle that we're not eating, obviously, or some part that we don't want, we can't eat the whole thing, we give the leftovers to the dog. Dog is happy as he can be to have the leftovers. I don't know if cats eat leftovers. Do cats eat leftovers? They strike me as more finicky than that. I have a couple nodding heads. Okay, so you have some very well-adjusted cats in your home. But she offers her substance and not what's left over. We could imagine somebody, maybe those putting in larger contributions, those who had greater means, so there's a greater obligation upon them. But we can imagine them saying, okay, this is the amount of my income, or these are my resources, and I need to use X amount for this need and X amount for that need, and I've got the college tuition fund over here for the kids, and you know we're helping out this neighbor who has some problems, so let's kind of figure out what we can give to the temple, and maybe sometimes it's not the first fruit, maybe it's the last fruit. But she gives all that she has because she has made not just a kind of financial calculation. If she had sat down and asked herself, what could I afford to give to the temple? The answer would be 0. I can afford to give 0 to the temple. I'm poor. I have no one to support me. I'm a widow. The impression is that he has no children, or at least none in the house who can help sustain her. We don't know her whole situation, but this is kind of the impression. But she's giving this money anyway, something she could not afford to do from a practical point of view. So she was not making a financial calculation. She was making a spiritual calculation, a spiritual decision. And shouldn't our giving, wherever it goes and to whomever it goes, and to whatever institution we entrust it, shouldn't our giving also be a spiritual decision, even more so than a financial decision? And her reckless generosity parallels the self-emptying of God himself, who did not hold back even his only begotten Son, a Son who fulfills and brings to completion this example of generosity through his complete self-offering upon the cross. So she's held up to as an example because she offers all that she has. She doesn't give God the leftovers, but the first fruits. And she's making this decision based upon spiritual criteria and not just financial or practical criteria. And the second reason the Lord holds her up to the apostles and to us is because her offering goes almost unnoticed. It doesn't make a lot of noise. Going down that tube, it doesn't attract any attention. But it ends up being more valuable than all the other offerings, which from a financial point of view were clearly and demonstrably more valuable. But hers is of greater value. Why? Because it is offered with the greatest spirit of generosity. Perhaps with the greatest spirit of sacrifice. With the greatest spirit of orienting her whole heart and her whole life upon the things of God. So it's more valuable than the others because the Lord is not just looking at the bottom line. He's looking at the heart. And it is possible, and in fact in this case it is evident, that the one who gives the smallest material offering of all, one that's going to be overlooked, one that no one pays any attention to, one that is not going to attract the attention of anybody, and the grand scheme of things won't make one whit of difference to the functioning of the temple, she still has the greatest heart of all the contributors on that day because She's giving herself. You know, when we make a financial contribution to somebody, we give somebody help who's struggling, we give somebody a little bit of a lift up, or we give some money to a person, you know, on the street, or we support an institution that helps the poor, for example, our own St. Vincent de Paul Society, or we help our parish, or we help the diocese, whatever it may be. When we make a financial gift, you know, that money that we give, just like when we make a gift of time and when we share our talents, that gift represents us, doesn't it? It represents us. That's why if it's misused, you know, we get riled up a little bit, and justifiably so, because it's as if someone had taken that trust that we put in them and then misused it. It'd be like trampling upon the donors who help support whatever the institution is aiming to accomplish. So these 2 pennies represented this woman. Her generosity represented her. Her whole self was put inside that receptacle of the temple. There was nothing left over. And this is why God praises her. And the only audience she needs is the audience of Christ himself, which is the most important audience of all. So she's held up as an example of strong faith. And she gives us kind of an illustration of what it means to live what the Lord was speaking about in the gospel last Sunday. Remember, he said, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. There are a lot of ways of doing that. This widow shows us one way of living God in such a complete and total act of self-gift. So the question for you and the question for me, upon hearing this gospel, reflecting upon it, seeing what's in the heart of this lady, who's a person of extraordinary faith and confidence in God, the question for us is simply this: am I willing to put everything in my life at the service of Christ? Or am I only willing to offer God the leftovers?